This chapter is all about working with 3D text. Now, 3D text is just extruded text, like working with extruded shapes or brush strokes or selections. But there are some differences between 3D text and other typical extruded objects. So I'm going to cover those characteristics in this lesson and cover a number of other 3D text subjects in upcoming lessons. So to follow along, go to Photoshop and start that up. Let's make a new document by going File, New. I'm going to work with this guy that I've been working with throughout the course. Click OK. Let's add some text. Go down to the Type tool there. Click on that to make it active. And type in some text. Type in 3D text. I'll accept that. And now I'm going to make it 3D by extruding it. So I go to the 3D panel, click on 3D extrusion, selected layer, and click Create. There we go. And we start in kind of an unusual position here because we made the text kind of high. You might not have done that, but I did. I'm going to make it look more normal by just taking my current view here and pulling it down a bit like that. So I have the ground plane down here instead of up above me. And now it looks kind of normal there, 3D text. Now, let's take a look at this. It's extruded, so you've got these 5 materials here, as you've seen before. The front and back inflations, the front and back bevels, and the extrusion. But it is a little bit different in terms of how it's set up compared to typical extruded 3D objects. Let me show you what I mean. Let's click on this top material here, the front inflation material. Take a look at diffuse. There is no little icon in there indicating that there's a file loaded up or a texture file loaded up for this front inflation material. There isn't a file for any of these guys. So I go through them all. You'll see they're all the same color here with no files here or here. But that's different than a typical extruded 3D object. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to turn this off for the time being, make a new layer, make a shape here by clicking on the Shape tool, draw out our fleur-de-lis that we've seen before if you've been following the course from front to back. We're going to make a 3D extrusion from the path, Create. There we go. Make that active there. And click on, let's say, the front inflation material, and look at its diffuse. Notice there's a little icon there indicating there's a file associated with this. It's called a texture file right there. It's loaded up already. And the rest of them have the same thing. They all have a file associated with them called the texture file. This is different than text. Let me show you the ramifications of that. If I click on this guy, and let's say I want to edit the texture, I'm going to get a message that this guy is involved with several other materials. So I'll click OK. And let's make it obviously different by giving it a color. So I go Shift F5 or I go Edit Fill. I'll make it a color here. And color. Select an obvious color. Well, blue works, I guess. Click OK. That's going to fill it with a color. Now I need to save it by closing it and saying, yep, let's save it. That applies blue to this thing right there. I'm going to click on this with my selection tool, make it active, rotate it around to the back. And lo and behold, it's back there too. It's not just on the front, it's on the back. What happens if I make a bevel out of this? So I'm going to click on this guy, I'm going to go to the cap properties, make a bevel here, and boom, it's there as well. Here I am trying to apply a color to the front, and I apply it to the front and the back and to the bevel on the front, and also, just to let you know, the bevel on the back. Not necessarily what I want to do. If I click away here for a second, let's say go back down to the front inflation. If I want to change the color of that, I need to go over here and say, give me a new texture or replace the texture. I have to have an individual texture for each one of these guys, and I've got to do it sort of after the fact here. It starts off with all these guys being applied to all elements of it except for the extrusion. That's the only one that's the exception here. That's the way that extruded objects work when you work with something like a shape. Let's turn that guy off and go back down to our text here. Turn that back on and select it. So I take a look at it again, and its front inflation does not have a file associated with it. So I can simply click on the color swatch, for example. I can give it its own color like red. Notice how it changes right away there. I can go down to the next one, the bevel, and give it a color as well from the original default one that we started with, which was brown. We don't have a bevel yet, but I'll show you how that looks. I'll go over here to the cap, give that a bevel, and you'll see that we did apply that color to that bevel. It's different than the rest of the colors. Go down to the third one, the extrusion. Give it a different color too. Go down to yellow, for example, make it obviously different. Now we've made 3 different colors. Each one of these materials behaves independently. So text is different that way. If I click on it to select it here, and then rotate it around a little bit, you'll see that we're all different colors there like that. All right, that's the first order of business that makes it different. Another thing you can do is that when you have text, you notice that the Properties panel has a T there, indicating that this is a special kind of Properties panel for this mesh. It's a Text Properties panel. And it gives you 3 more things down here, the text color, the character panel, and edit source. Now be aware that this little color swatch here, if we go over here and change that color to anything, whatever it will be, it's going to apply that color to every single material. So that just overrides all the work we did to apply it to separate materials there. But that's just how that works. If I want to change the font or other characteristics of the characters, I can go to the character panel and change that here from, let's say, this particular font to something else, let's say Times New Roman or something like that. There we go, and it changes it right on the fly. Make it faux bold like that, or turn that off. Make it real bold and italic, for example, like that. We can make it all caps, however you want to do this. Any work you do inside here shows up immediately in your 3D world over there. Change the font size over here. All these kinds of things show up instantly in your 3D text over there. If I click on this color, it's the same as clicking on that color swatch over there. It applies to all 5 materials. Finally, we can also go to Edit Source, which is really effective. Once you do all this work creating this text, you can change the text if you need to. So let's click on Edit Source. It allows us to change the original text that we've got here. So I'm going to click on this, make it active. Let's just click this last part here. Instead of text, let's put in type. It seems to have run off the page, so let's go to the character panel and make it a little bit smaller. And that will show up now when we save this. So I'll close this down. Save that now by closing this and saying, yep, let's save it. Now it says 3D type, and it also makes it smaller to match the changes we made in the character panel. Now I want to explain one more thing. If I go back to Edit Source, let's say I apply a style to this. I go over here and click on the Style panel that I've opened down here. Change the style to something like that. And it shows up down here inside the type layer. And I'm going to save that by closing it down and saying, yep, let's save it. The style does not show up over here. You cannot apply a style to the type and have it show up here in the 3D text. The way you can apply a style is by applying it directly to one of the materials. If I want to apply that same style, for example, to one of the materials, I'd open up the 3D panel like this. I'd select the front inflation material, and now I would edit the diffuse material and go over here, say a new texture like that. And then I'd open up that texture, edit the texture. It's going to be just a blank slate here. I'd make it gray, for example, so I'd go Edit Fill, fill it with some gray thing. Let's just say 50% gray, for example, and then apply a style to that. So I can go over here and double click and apply a style to that surface there. And now I'd save that. Now that will show up on the front of our text. So if you want to apply a style, for example, you can't go over here and then click on Edit Source and apply a style that way. You apply it to the appropriate material. And while that may seem to be a bump in the road, it does give you more control over how your 3D text looks. And I think you can see that 3D text has just a little bit more utility than any other kind of extruded 3D object here inside Photoshop.